So we're leveling off. So maybe we'll go ahead and get started. The bulk, kind of the heft of the presentation, Dr. Kearns is going to cover in a few slides anyway. So in the beginning, just a couple housekeeping items. We are going to be sharing the slides, and we are going to be sharing a recording of this webinar. So it will be available to people either that are here on the call, or folks that have to drop early. We'll be able to make that available. So this is our webinar that follows up what we've done about a month ago. We had an overview of our models, and we got a lot of requests for deep dives into the model specifically. What we think of as really our most important models, our flood model. Today's webinar is really going to focus on the flood model, and then the work that our flood modeling team does, which is led by Dr. Kearns. And as part of that, we'll go through the process of what the inputs are into the models, some of the things that set our model apart from other models, and then some high-level implications associated with what we're finding in our models. And then I'm also going to take a second to walk you through the way we've integrated this onto the risk factor tool, and we'll talk about some of the different products we're building. It's a really exciting time at First Street right now, given all the hazards and the peril development that we've done in our work towards shifting into actually being able to create a lot of these implications around the exposures. So I'm Dr. Jeremy Porter. I'll be here working with Dr. Kearns. Dr. Kearns, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself to everyone.
Hi, yeah, I'm Ed Kearns, the Chief Science Officer here at First Street. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, and maybe we'll put the slides up. Yeah, and we'll get started from here.
Okay.
All right. So we'll go to the next slide. Our mission here at First Street is to connect climate change to financial risk, and we've built over the past. If we'll go to the next slide, Ed, we've actually started back in 2016, actually founding the company, First Street Foundation, and over that time, we've been building out our models so that now we have a flood model, a wildfire model, a wind model, a heat model, and an air quality model. All of those different models are really focused around exposure to different climate hazards. We've been able to build all of these models at a high resolution. For instance, the model that Dr. Kearns is going to talk about today is our flood model. It's a 3-meter resolution flood model. It gives us the ability, when you add in the complexity of both the high resolution and the nuances associated with the return periods and the depths associated with those return periods, to really dig in around flood risk in a way that a lot of other models aren't able to. You can see on the slide that's currently on the screen sort of the development of the models, and progressively we've been building out all of these different climate hazard models, and along the way we've done a lot of work around not only exposure but also economic damages from those models, community risk to those different models. And we've gotten to the point now, as of late last year, where we've actually launched our first focused implications product, which is our migration model. All the models preceding that were really focused on direct implications of damage, direct implications of exposure to these different climate hazards. As we started to build out our climate migration model, we started to work into the space of indirect implications of exposure. What happens to communities when critical infrastructure is impacted? What happens to communities when roads frequently flood and become a nuisance to people that live in those communities? We're actually able to find that people are moving away from those communities, and there are downstream effects associated with that have larger macroeconomic impacts. And then this year, our most recent products, we launched our air quality model, as we mentioned earlier this year in February, and we're working now on our newest product, which Dr. Kearns can speak to, also on correlated risk, which is going to allow us not only to understand exposure and damages from each of these models independently, but also to understand for any given location how these climate hazards impact that risk together, and then from a portfolio perspective, how disparate exposure across a large geographic network can also impact a larger portfolio. I don't know, Dr. Kearns, if you had any words you wanted to tease on that correlated risk product we're building?
Yeah, no, it's an important concept because we want to make sure that we're taking into account, what climate change is doing to the probability of loss, right? So basically climate change has got its thumb on the scale. There are correlations through the atmosphere due to climate change that such as drought and wildfire are correlated. If you're going to have one, you're more likely to have the other. So if you don't take those correlations into account, you could possibly underestimate your risk. And so we want to make sure that we're capturing every aspect of climate change and how it's impacting your exposure to these perils.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is it really enhances our offerings here at First Street. It gives us now the ability to look at point-specific property exposure for any property, given our high resolution, rigorous scientific model, peer-reviewed models. But it also gives us the ability to look at it from a correlated risk CAT modeling perspective, where now we can look at risk across portfolios as opposed to only at the property. So we really are building our use cases around the data that we're developing here at First Street with this correlated risk product. And then add one more slide there. And the last thing I'll do before I hand it over to Ed is just remind everybody that as we build these models, the reason why it's taken us so long since 2016 is we do work through the scientific process. We are peer reviewing all of our research papers. They're being vetted and reviewed by experts in the field. We're getting feedback on these papers. We're constantly updating those models until we get them to the point to where we're ready to launch new models. To this point, we have 26 peer-reviewed papers covering both the exposure, the development of climate hazards, and the implications of exposure to those climate hazards. We have 10 risk assessments, again, focused on climate hazard development and exposure, but also implications of that exposure. And we have 7 distinct model types, which I covered in the last slide. So today we're here with that larger context, really to focus on flood and to dig into the flood model. There's nobody better to do that than Dr. Ed Kearns, so I'll hand it over to him and let him walk through the model.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. It is very exciting to use this open science approach because we get to share everything about how we're doing it. It engenders trust in our products. There's no black boxes that people have to wonder, how did you come up with that estimate? How did you come up with that risk? It's all out there for the user to read. Now, in today's deep dive, I promise you, we're not getting into equations. I'm not going to put up partial differential equations and dig that deep. If you want to dig that deep, we do have lots of documentation about the model. As Dr. Porter was mentioning, there are peer-reviewed publications supporting this, and also online methodological documents to get into the nitty-gritty of how we do this. Dr. Porter also mentioned that we'll be sending around these slides. These are links to the different documentation about the flood model that you can dive into if you want to get really, really deep into the weeds. Today, I'll try to keep it at a kind of a general audience level. To explain how we're creating these high resolution products, why we're creating them, and what value they have in doing climate risk assessments. So we're starting with the computation engine at the center of our flood model is based upon about a 25-year-old open source model called LizFlood that was developed in Europe and is widely used around the globe today. So there's a link here where if you so want to, you want to download the model yourself, that computation engine at the heart of the First Street flood model, you can do so. And the way that we leverage this flood model is that we separate it into riverine, rainfall, surge, and tidal components, and we run it many times for these different components to resolve the flooding that is resulting from each one. And it's a physically based model. This is not a statistical model. So it's not using past observations to say, oh, it's likely to flood here. No, it's actually simulating rainfall on the surface, how that rainfall moves across the surface, collects into streams and rivers, and moves downhill, basically. And so with that, we can have a lot of confidence in the resolution that the model gives us, because it brings us, we can calculate these at 30 meters that we can then downscale to 3-meter resolution. That's about 10 feet. So we can resolve what the flood is across the Earth's surface at 10-foot resolution. We'll keep coming back to this idea of resolution and property specific and asset specific all through this talk today. It's very, very important. It's central to our work to be able to say what's happening at your particular location or at a particular location, not just in your county, not just in your census tract, not just in your state. But this is a very, very specific measurement, and it varies a lot across the landscape. The other thing that we really lean on these physically based models such as LizFlood for is when we're projecting into the future, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, when we're looking at climate change and trying to see how things are changing in the future. If we're relying on a statistically based model, we'd have questions about whether we can trust the statistics that we have today 30 years from now, when we're going into a world that none of us have seen before. None of us have experienced the future climate. But with these physically based models, one thing we can be sure of is that the physics today is going to be the same physics in 30 years. So we look at the different inputs to these models. That's what we're going to be modifying in order to make predictions about how flood is changing 30 years from now. As I mentioned, we're looking at the different modes of flood. So we take into account tidal flood, coastal flooding, heavy precipitation, also called pluvial, riverine flooding, sometimes called fluvial flooding, and then hurricane surge. So we are modeling each one of these separately, and we combine their effects. We also track their effects. So if it's important for your application that you know which mode of this flooding is affecting your location the most, we can present that information. If you're just looking to see what is the water depth that is expected, we also have that available, of course, too. The way that we drive this model, this physically based model, is it's very dependent upon quality inputs, and we use our authoritative U.S. government data as much as possible. I used to work for the federal government for many years, and I was a big open data guy. There's a lot of value of open government data, of course, to industry and to the public. We are leveraging that value. We are using NOAA data, USGS data, NASA data, FEMA data, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers data, as well as the international communities, the World Climate Research Program's climate models. So when you hear about climate models, in the popular media, this is always pointing at that international community that has worked for many years to create at great computational expense and scientific expense these climate models that we're all looking at, analyzing, trying to understand what the future holds for us. So we lean heavily on these simulations. We are on the 6th version of these climate models. It's called CMIP6. And there's different scenarios within those climate models, looking at different pathways, socioeconomic pathways for carbon use and economic use. And so we're focusing on what's kind of a mid-range, which is called SSP 245 in the lingo. It's kind of an optimistic outlook actually for the next 30 years, but we're also considering a worst case high bound scenario. Sometimes it's called SSP 585. And we're also looking at a very optimistic view, which is SSP 126, which is a low bound. So we know that the future is going to hold us somewhere between the high bound and low bound, probably somewhere close to that middle of the road. But we're trying to describe that entire range so we can understand that. Now, those climate models are relatively coarse resolution. They're anywhere from 25 to 100 kilometers in spatial resolution when they're modeling the entire globe. When we're using for our inputs, we're using NASA's downscaled model inputs from a group called NASA Next GDDP. It's widely used around the world. We're leveraging NASA's expertise to help us understand how those climate models are going to be used. The outputs from those climate models can be used to drive our flood model. So we use a higher resolution model output from NASA in order to get our resolution that we're shooting for our flood model. As you can see in this list, there's a lot of things, but I'll call your attention to the elevation data because this is a very, very important aspect of flood modeling, of course, is what the actual elevation is. We are using the latest data from the USGS. There's a program called 3DEP that has been collecting LiDAR. It's a laser ranging technology over the last decade. So some of these LiDAR data sets are 1 meter horizontal resolution. We are shooting for a 3 meter product here. And so, it's very heavily dependent upon the quality of that data. And this is the highest quality data that's available in the US today. And of course, as I mentioned before, leaning heavily on USGS and NOAA weather data, stream gauge data, as well as historical hurricane tracks. So yes, a lot of data going into this. This is very much an integration of a lot of existing high quality data sources. Sometimes those high quality data sources, though, have issues, and sometimes we have to create new ones to augment or supplement what is available from the U.S. government. And if we do so, and I'll describe one case in which we've done exactly that, but if we do so, we turn to the peer-reviewed literature. That's what we do as scientists, is we submit our work to the scientific community for peer review. Our peers literally review what we have done. They gauge the quality of our work and they say whether it's acceptable or not, if that's a good idea or not. If it's deemed a good idea, then it gets published in the literature, and that's how we get the word out to everybody about exactly what we are doing. We also attend scientific conferences, both national and international conferences, and talk about our work there too. So if you want the really deep dive, yeah, come see us at those conferences too. We're always happy to get into the gory details. One of these examples of an input that we've had to modify is a precipitation climatology. So this says, if you look over the past, how heavy has rain fall? When does it fall? What duration? What intensity? What frequency does a precipitation fall with? NOAA for many years has created something called Atlas 14 in the business it's known as. And for many years also, we've all understood, those of us in the business understood that Atlas 14 was considering not climate change, but considering climate to be stationary. So they weren't really resolving yet how climate change has changed precipitation intensity, duration, and frequency across the US. To NOAA's credit, they pushed very hard for funding and have gotten it. So we're all very excited that NOAA has got the resources now to redo Atlas 14 to take into account climate change. They're working hard on this right now, and they're going to call it Atlas 15. And so that's all great. But one of the things is here for First Street is that this is a risk that's happening today. We can't wait for 4 or 5 years for these results to be ready, because as we've all seen, maybe in the news or we've experienced in our everyday lives, that events are becoming heavier. They are flooding more towns more frequently. We saw in, I think it was Vermont last year, right? Very severe rainfall. It exceeded all expectations. Happened in Fort Lauderdale the year before that. The list goes on and on, unfortunately, right? So what we want to do at First Street, we want to resolve what those changes are now, use that information in our flood model so that we can project what the current risk is for flood today, and also carry that forward 30 years. So this precipitation model that Dr. Jung Ho Kim at First Street had created is very valuable to us. Again, it's been published. It relies on NOAA's method for how they had created Atlas 14. It uses high quality NOAA data from their automated surface observing systems. And then like I said, uses the very similar method to create new estimates of precipitation intensity, duration, and frequency that we can use to drive our flood model. So Dr. Kim did this by examining the last 20 or 30 years of data and considering to be separate, distinct from previous records. So you can see those changes occurring over time. And indeed, we see large changes, particularly in the 1 hour severity of rainfalls in many parts of the country. And again, like I said, we've been experiencing this for the last 10. This is not something that is over the horizon that might be happening. We're experiencing it now. We have been experiencing it for the last 20 years. But this is a very accurate measurement of exactly that, and we use that going forward in our flood model. Another thing we did at First Street that we needed to create was a better record of what the flood adaptation features are across the U.S. By flood adaptation features, I mean that built infrastructure that protects our communities today. Many cities have, most cities probably have infrastructure in place, whether it's levees or pumps or canals, things that are going to be moving heavy floodwaters and protecting homes and businesses across the U.S. There's a federal repository called the National Levee Database that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers maintains. That's only got like about 9,000, sounds like a lot, but there's many more than 9,000 levees across the U.S. So First Street had sent out people into the field to walk into offices and local governments to collect information on the local adaptation features. And we've amassed a database of 23,000 such features, so that when we run our flood model, we also bring in, on the back end of that flood model, we also take into account what the design specification is for that adaptation feature. And then we can make sure that it's removing that much water, and so the flooding is not happening in those areas that are protected up to that level of protection. Dr. Porter, do you have a question for me?
Yeah, we've gotten a couple questions around downscaling and the development of the high resolution model. both in terms of the terrain that goes into the model, but then also our overall downscaling process. Maybe you want to speak to those questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yes. So we're modeling at 30-meter resolution, as I mentioned, but then we're using the land surface at 3-meter resolution to take those model results and make them fit the contours of the land surface. So we can resolve creeks, we can resolve streams, we can, up to about 10 feet. So we can resolve, as you'll see in some later figures, we can resolve the flooding on a property, whether or not it's going to reach the building on that property or not, whether that water stays in the stream or overflows its banks. These are all things that we can determine from this. But yeah, it is a two-step process. We model at 30 meter and then we downscale using that high resolution 3-depth based surface topography to the 3-meter level.
And there's a follow-up question around calibration and some of the work that goes on post the development of models as we continue to refine and build the models. Is there anything we can say about calibration at this point?
Oh yeah, we could talk a whole hour about calibration and validation if we'd like to. So the model itself is validated to make sure it performs. Again, as I said, list flood's been around for 25 years at least. But the model itself is validated against known events, and we've simulated many dozens of events to further validate those models. As events happen, we can also recreate those as well to see how well they match to our results. One of the hardest things to validate, I'll acknowledge, is the pluvial, the heavy rainfall events, mainly because they are very ephemeral, and so it's hard to get good observations from satellites or other places. Other means following the pluvial events, because that high water that happens after a very heavy rainfall, as that rain percolates into the ground and starts to move downhill, that maximum depth only lasts for a few minutes. And so trying to resolve that sometimes is a challenge from a validation standpoint. But unfortunately, as I said, we get lots of validation events every year. And we're working on different ways of collecting that information to be able to share it with the public so people can understand how those events are validating.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, keep on moving along. Again, like I said, we're going to continue to talk about how important it is to have a high resolution. And we're also looking, again, as I was just talking about, we're going from 30-meter resolution to 3-meter resolution based upon the best quality USGS 3-depth LiDAR data. We can make flood estimates under different intensities for every building, for every property in the US. It's very, very important point that we can be that specific in our predictions. There's a lot of good government sources out there for flood risk, from FEMA, from NOAA, from others, from USGS, some local sources as well. One of the things that is very difficult, though, is if you want to get down beyond a county level or a census tract level, it is very hard to get that particular, using some of those federal data sets, down to an individual business, down to an individual building, down to an individual residence. But that has always been our aim at First Street, is to make it that specific and that personal, because that makes the data the most useful. And so these flood risk estimates under different intensities, this is what drives us. This is the information that we're trying to make available to businesses that might have to do reporting on climate risk if they're a publicly traded company, for banks that are holding different mortgages, and the Federal Reserve Bank or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is going to be requiring them to report on the risk within their portfolios. These are the kinds of very specific information that they need. For the individual homeowner or individual business owner, they also need to know what is the risk now and how that's going to be changing over time, because you might want to insure yourself against that kind of risk. If you're a business or homeowner, make sure you have enough insurance, that you understand how things are changing over time, because these can be very hard to discern from some federal sources. So, for example, the FEMA significant flood hazard areas, the so-called FEMA flood zones. This is the authoritative way that the U.S. government looks at flood risk across the U.S. Most people assume, whether they're inside or outside a FEMA flood zone, that they have risk or they don't have risk. Unfortunately, that doesn't tell the whole story, because those flood zones don't capture heavy rainfall. and those FEMA flood zones are not capturing climate change. And so people continue to be surprised that they don't have enough insurance for their business or don't have enough insurance for their home, and they've just had a flood event. It can be devastating financially. So we want to try to get this information out there so that everybody can see exactly and be aware of how these things are changing. And for the last 20 years, about 40% of flood claims across the U.S. have come from outside FEMA flood zones. So this is not a new problem that people didn't know about before, and FEMA is working on this. And with their new risk rating 2.0 and the new NFIP ratings for flood insurance, they are addressing this. They've included heavy rainfall now. That's excellent. But the flood zones still do not have that as part of the definition, and neither of them have climate change yet. So in any case, but it is very important, again, as I said, to make sure that this information is done at a specific geographic location as possible. So when we're looking at the current flood risk driven by these inputs, and we're validating against actual events, how do we scale forward into the future? So we use the same flood model. We're using similar inputs, but we're scaling them based upon how the climate models are projecting future conditions. So if it's going to rain 20% harder, for example, 30 years from now in your particular location, that will be built into the inputs of the model, and we run the model again, and we see what that increase of 20% of rainfall is going to do at your location. How is it going to change these things? And again, we're using the climate models from the CMIP6, the World Climate Research Program's international climate models. We're also using them together as an ensemble. We use about 20 of them together because all the models give slightly different results. So we combine them in a way that we can reduce the uncertainties across models and come up with a more predictable result. An example of this kind of approach that I often call upon, because it's familiar to most of you, is hurricane forecasting. So if you've ever watched a hurricane forecasting, so-called spaghetti plots of different hurricane models that are projecting different paths for a hurricane that's, say, approaching the U.S. Gulf Coast or the U.S. East Coast, you've all seen this on the news or seen these kinds of presentations on the web or social media. So what a forecaster does is take many models and decide which models are making the most sense, bind those together, and then use them in some kind of averaging scheme so you can get the most accurate forecast from multiple models informing that. We're using the same kind of approach here with climate models. We use multiple models. They have slightly different projections in the future, but by binding them together, averaging across these models, we can have more confidence in what those projections are. And these projections are for stronger hurricanes or heavier rainfall or heavier stream flows. And we build those into the flood model. Then we run the flood model again under different climate scenarios. As I mentioned earlier today, that we're also using a high bound, the so-called SSP 585, which is kind of an extreme upper bound of what we expect climate change to bring. And then a lower bound, the so-called SSP 126, which assumes that the world's governments are taking action against, on carbon, and then things are going to be getting better very soon. Somewhere in the middle is where the reality is. And so we're shooting for the SSP 245, which is kind of the middle of the road, but still slightly optimistic projection going out 30 years in the future. Why do we pick 30 years? Well, it is kind of a planning horizon for most people. 30-year mortgage is very common in the US, so that makes a lot of sense to people that are homeowners in the US. And also 30 years is a very common planning horizon in business as well. So we're looking at 30 years. We can go beyond that as well, but all the numbers that you'll see presented are looking at today going out to 30 years. Our final flood model outputs at 3-meter resolution. So we're looking at the current hazard. So what depth of water could you expect at your location or a specific location or groups of locations? And we look at different so-called return periods. Return periods, you often have heard like the 1 in a 100-year storm, 1 in 500-year storm. This is a way of looking at the frequency. What is the likelihood of that severity of an event occurring today? And we model a range of those, all the way from the every other year, the 1 in 2, we do that at the coast, the 1 in 5, the 1 in 200, 1 in 100, 1 in 250, 1 in 500 years. So a 500-year event is a 0.2% annual chance. 1 in 100 is a 1% annual chance. If you kind of remember that, the 1 in 100 is very commonly used, particularly with FEMA flood zones. That's what the definition is there, is the 1% annual chance. That doesn't mean that you can't have multiple events of that same intensity in the same year. It gets very confusing when you hear how these things sometimes are reported. But it is a probabilistic way of viewing flood risk. And by running our model under these different probabilistic scenarios, we can build up basically a map across different probabilities, so you can see the different intensities of those events, what the likelihood is of those occurring in your area, and if they occur, how deep the flood would be. So we do that for the 2024 conditions. Then we scale the inputs that I've described previously by using the climate model data that I just discussed on the last slide. We look out 30 years into the future, and then we run the model again, over and over and over again. And then we create those scenarios, and we can interpolate across these years, because the effects of climate change are fairly linear across this range right now. And so for the inputs, and we can do that. And what the physical models can tell us is if we do hit any tipping points, if any of those inputs are reaching points that the physics is actually going to cause a big change, those are the things we can also resolve. Again, something else that we could not get from a statistical model that we can get from these physically based models as well. Then we look backward, as Dr. Porter was asking questions before this. Maybe you had asked about the calibration and validation. We look at historic events. We look at events as they've just happened, and we look to see how these things are occurring. And we also look against not just the physical damages, physical flood, but we also look at claims. So when we're looking at losses, again, as Dr. Porter mentioned, we translate this climate risk into financial risk. We're also trying to calibrate against known losses. It's very hard to get that information a lot of times, as Dr. Porter knows. But that information that we can get, we are looking at those claims, those flood claims, to see how our damage projections align against the losses that have been reported. I see Dr. Porter is back, perhaps with another question.
Yeah, I heard my name, so I popped on. So I just to follow up, I mean, flood, in the case of flood, we are lucky to some degree that we do have a national backstop for the insurance program through the NFIP, but we know there's not tremendous take up of the NFIP, and we know it doesn't cover a lot of areas outside of the SFHA, but we do also have access to depth grids from historic events. We have access to IA claims, SBA claims, NFIP claims. So by coupling all that information together, we are able to build a sort of a spatial layer of exposure and damages that are associated with that. So that feeds directly into that calibration and validation point that you made.
Yeah. And NFIP is a great public program that, if people understand they have risk, participating in that is probably a very, very good thing. I guess flood, like I said, flood damage can be absolutely devastating, and the private market doesn't have much in the way of flood insurance. So the NFIP is definitely the way to go. Dr. Porter, do you have another question?
No, I think we're answering questions as they come up, and I think you can go ahead and move forward in the presentation.
All right, thank you. So to kind of give an image and say how are we doing this? How are we creating this property specific information, asset specific information, going building by building across the U.S. and property by property across the U.S. So we lean on some commercial data partners that aggregate parcel and building information, mostly from county tax assessors' offices and similar across the U.S. This is mostly public information, but it takes a lot of effort to aggregate it. It's in lots of different formats, as you can probably imagine, across the U.S. But so we partner with them, and we use that information to know where every building is, where every parcel is across the U.S. And since we're doing our hazard layers at 3-meter resolution, it's basically, I call it a cookie cutter approach, where you can take the footprint of that building or the outline of that polygon of that parcel, and you can cut out what the hazard is from the hazard map, what the hazard is likely to be within that space. And so by taking those parcel outlines, the building footprints, checking them against, doing that cookie cutter against the hazard layer, we can then, for every property or every building, we can say what the max or average depth is of water to that facility, to that home, to that business, and then you can start to understand what the possible damages are going to be to that asset from that exposure. So how do we start to calculate that damage? So what we're looking at is the likelihood of having that amount of water in the building, and we can add that up probabilistically across the entire range that we've modeled. So this flooding likelihood that you see in this figure here, the 50%, that's the 1 in every 2 year, and on the far right, the 0.2%, that's the annual flooding likelihood. That's the 1 in 500 year. Okay, so adding those up across the range, we can then say what the expectation is, how much water is going to be in that building. So, of course, the building could be raised up on stilts. It could be hardened against flooding. These are all things that we can take into account to see how much damage there is likely to be. When we're looking at, across the U.S., this is looking at the 1 in 100 year risk, or the 1% annual risk. What's the difference between what we're expecting from, say, like the FEMA flood zones and what we're seeing across the U.S.? What we're seeing is the number of properties with 1 in 100 risk is much greater than what you'd expect in those FEMA flood zones, as I mentioned before. But yeah, we're seeing about 18 million properties today. So that's about that's much greater than are within the FEMA flood zones. That have that 1% annual risk today. And you're seeing concentrations of them in places that you might expect, like along the Gulf Coast or in Florida or along the Eastern Seaboard. But you're also seeing a lot of them appear in places that you might not have expected, such as the Appalachians, right, in West Virginia and Virginia. And again, so this comes down to, again, a resolution issue. Can you resolve in the modeling those kind of small creeks and rivers that are going to drive up this kind of risk, because it's taking the heavy rainfalls and bringing those into flood conditions in these different counties that are shown here. And I see Dr. Porter is back, probably with another question.
So, and I just wanted to follow up on this slide, exactly what you're saying. Our model, it actually found about 2.2 times as many properties with 100-year flood risk relative to what are currently located within FEMA's 100-year special flood hazard area. And in our own research, when we first launched the model, we found really good alignment between our models and FEMA's model in coastal storm surge areas and in main river channels. So ultimately, the places where FEMA's model is designed to work really well, we align really well. As Dr. Kearns mentioned, the models currently don't include small waterway flooding. They don't include tributary, stream, small river flooding, or heavy precipitation flooding directly on the elevation grid. So that's where you see those big blotches of flooding that are in central Pennsylvania and central New York, all the way through the Appalachian region. And that's where we really see our biggest discrepancies between our model, the risk that we see in our model, the damages associated with that, lack of uptake of insurance for flood risk, because lots of times people don't know that they have that risk in those areas. But those are really the primary drivers where we're seeing that 2.2 times more properties in our flood zone versus the SFHAs.
Yeah. And then, of course, climate change then comes along and increases it yet again. So in 30 years, again, we're including climate change in our estimates. We add another 1.2 million properties on top of that 17.9 million already. So in some of these areas, it's increasing a lot, sometimes by 20%. In some areas across the U.S., sometimes the increase is slight. But the idea is this is measurable, this is quantifiable, this is discoverable, and if you've got the information, you can prepare. And so, yeah, very, very, very important. So translating that physical risk into loss is something that both businesses and homeowners need. Again, understand what kind of insurance you might need. It's also very important for businesses that have to do climate reporting. The new SEC regulations are out. California just passed a bill that requires this kind of reporting, phased in over the next couple of years as well, that publicly traded companies are going to have to, and banks are going to have to be able to describe how climate risk is going to be impacting their businesses and their portfolios. So being able to translate that physical exposure to flood at the building level to dollars of losses is very important. And one way we can do this is we work with an engineering firm called Arup. They're our good partners, and they take an engineering, first principles of engineering approach to that damage. So rather than trying to estimate what the value of that asset or that building or that facility is, they're looking at what's the physical aspects of that building as water starts to reach different things, the first floor to get to the elevators, as to get to the HVAC systems. So they are calculating from their experience as engineers what the cost is to repair or replace those kinds of buildings those kinds of infrastructure in those buildings for a wide range, for dozens and dozens of what they call archetypes, different types of buildings, from whether it's a warehouse to a skyscraper to a single floor residential home to a two-story home to whichever. They've got the full range of archetypes, and so we can assess every building against their first principle of engineering estimates of losses and add those up. Arup also provides a 10th and 90th percentile, as well as the median estimate of what those costs are. So we can also project some uncertainties around those costs to repair or replace following a flood. One of the other things that's very important too is, particularly for commercial facilities, but is how long is that building going to be out of service? Is it not going to be generating income for a business? Often the downtime for repair, the cost related to that can exceed the physical repair cost of the building. So for businesses that have to do that kind of climate reporting, having very specific information about what the expectation is, again, relying on Arup's expertise in engineering and their databases of losses and impacts to all the different types of buildings that they analyze, we also can come up with an estimate of what the downtime for repair is. And a company can take that and use that to understand what their loss of income is going to be from that facility if it were to flood. Now, across the U.S., flood is the most prevalent and most costly climate peril. If you sum this up for the 1 in 100 year or the 1% annual risk, we're seeing 17.9 million properties, as Dr. Porter was just mentioning. That's going to be increasing to 19.1. The average annual loss, based upon these projections at the 1%, goes from $61 billion to almost $80 billion in 30 years. So with these kinds of estimates, again, this is a national roll-up, and you can see here how this risk and this loss is distributed across the U.S. With this kind of information, our intention is at First Street that people can prepare. You can prepare your business, you can prepare your home. Climate change doesn't have to take you by surprise. You can understand how this is going to happen. You can be prepared for these kinds of losses through insurance or hardening your home or whatever it might be, or hardening your business against these kinds of risks. When we're looking at the infrastructure risk, this is acknowledging that while your home or your business, you may have taken those precautions, you may have raised it, you may have hardened against flooding, but the community in which that asset is placed may suffer from flooding in ways that will make it very hard to get to that home or very hard to get to that business, right? So we've also, because we're assessing the entire landscape from coast to coast, we also can assess airports, fire stations, hospitals, police stations, we can power stations, wastewater treatment plants, all of those kinds of infrastructure. We can assess how much water is going to be there likely in the future, so you can know whether those facilities will be out of service or not. Social infrastructure as well. If you're living in a community, but the government buildings and the places of worship and the schools are going to be affected, that means that community is not going to be able to function as it once did if it's suffering under higher flood risk. And of course, also roads, right? Getting in and out of these facilities also matter too. So we've assessed every 100 meters of roadway across the U.S. also too, to see whether or not those roads that are leading to these facilities or to these homes are likely to be underwater and serviceable or not. And if you add this up across the U.S., it is very stark that 25% of the critical infrastructure in the U.S. is at risk at this 1 in 100 or 1% annual risk. 23% of the roads are exposed to this level of risk. 20% of commercial properties, 17% of social infrastructure, and 14% of residential properties. Over 12 million are at risk of flooding today. So these are all, again, very stark numbers, But whether you're reporting or you're preparing this kind of specific information for your particular home, your particular business, or if you are a business that holds many properties, say in a commercial real estate portfolio, or you're a bank and you've got lots of mortgages on your book, these are First Street's data can help inform decisions that you can make to be prepared for this kind of risk. And Dr. Porter, I see you're back, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and one question for you as we do that. So and we've talked about this a lot internally. So it's I'm glad that this came up. There was a question around our use of AI and integrating AI into our models, whether we're patching data gaps, we're validating with it, are we using it at all, and if not, are we planning to use it into the future?
We are not using AI right now. This is something that, again, we're leaning on the physically based models instead to tell us, because we just can't trust AI right now. So it's a very interesting tool for pattern matching and understanding how some things might be emerging. It may have its application, but right now we're not using AI in any of our models. Sometimes we'll use machine learning for things like our heat model, our air quality, pieces of our air quality model, in order to create inputs for those kinds of things. It's more of a statistical method that is much more deterministic. Part of the problem with AI is a very cool technology, but it's very, very hard to understand why it arrives at the answers that it does. The scientific community is considering this right now. The weather forecasting, if you haven't looked at Google AI and weather forecasting, some amazing things are going on right now with that. But it comes down to its AI's ability to pattern match and predict how patterns are changing, where patterns might emerge. It's really cool technology, but it's not something that we're applying at First Street, and don't have plans to put this in the pipeline anytime soon, quite honestly.
Great. So I'll walk through a really quick overview of how we've integrated this data into Risk Factor, and then we should still have time to answer a couple questions live after that. So I think if you'll let me share screen.
Okay, I'm up and share.
So all of this data at this point has been integrated onto riskfactor.com. We have the data. Well, while I'm on the screen, I'll come back to this, but we have the data in a couple of different formats currently for people to access through bulk data. So people that want national, state, local geographies, if they want the roll-up of our data, all of it's at the property level, but you can access the data in whatever level of measurement or aggregations you might be interested in. We do have the capacity now to do portfolio pools, where we can portfolio match actual business locations, property locations. Generally, all we need is a lat long. We can feed back all the information for all the properties that are in a portfolio. And then we also have API access. So we do have the data available in a lot of different ways. But one of the ways that a lot of people know us for is that we've integrated all of this data onto our riskfactor.com tool. And so I have a property that I'll highlight quickly on riskfactor.com, one that has been curated. We know that it has risk, but it gives us the ability to kind of walk through the process and show you sort of what this looks like. So when you first go to riskfactor.com, you enter your address like I just did on the landing page. And from there, you can see right away we have these different climate reports associated with the different climate hazards and perils that we've produced. You can see for this property in Darien, the highest level of risk is flood. There's a 9 out of 10 on flood factor, but you can also see there's high risk from our wind factor and from heat factor. Also pretty high risk from air factor in the area in the Northeast. Not surprisingly, pretty low risk from fire. But for each one of these, as you go through and look at the different reports, we've coupled a lot of different information together. All the things that Ed was talking through in his presentation, but then even more is sort of captured here in each one of these different reports. So to start off with, on our flood overview, we show you the likelihood of flooding over a 30-year period, but we also break that down. So this gives you the ability to understand that all of our data, while it spans out 30 years, we have the ability to understand risk at any given aggregation of time. So if you're interested in your property's risk over the next 7 years, over the next 3 years, over the next 8 years, we can present the data in that type of way. So both the spatial resolution at a property level and the temporal aggregation of the data as an annual statistic gives us the ability really to report the data in a lot of different ways. But this shows you the flood risk this year, in 15 years, over the next 30 years, is the cumulative risk over this time period. There's a parametric approach on this first part of the report where you can actually adjust it. And maybe the property is raised 3 feet off the ground, so you're only interested in what's the likelihood of having 4 feet of water next to the property. But this gives you the ability to look at and understand that risk over this time period. We also have historical flood data associated with each one of these properties. So here, for this property, we can see that since for our historic events, we have historic events since 2005 that we've been modeling out. We can actually see that this property has been hit by, or has at least been in the area of 3 historic events that we've modeled that's been impacted directly by one, Hurricane Sandy, where you can see the 2.4 feet of water in October 2012, see the total number of properties, but we could also view it on the map. So we can go in and look at the property, get an understanding of what the historic risk looks like overall. You can see the layer here from the impact of Sandy. If we just zoom into the property, you can see the area. Maybe I want to change this to satellite so I can actually see the property itself, but you can see the risk associated with Sandy and the recreated depths associated with the storm. The map layer on riskfactor.com is also really nice because it gives you the ability to cycle through a lot of our different offerings. The current and future risk is housed here. So if we were interested in a 5% probability or a 20-year flood, we could look at that. We can see the primary source of flooding for this property is coastal flooding, but then we can look at it over time, and you can look at it in 15 years and 30 years. Again, internally, we'd be able to look at this on an annual basis, but you can really start to see the resolution of the underlying models. You can see where the properties are built up at the center of the property lots. You can see the road networks start to pop out. But this gives us the ability to start to look at the actual risk associated with each of these different properties, with a lot of different nuance associated with how we're interested in looking at it. We also have flood protections. This is a new feature that we're now visualizing on the site. We'll highlight the levees, the seawalls, the pumps, anything that's proximate to this property. You can see here that there's a levee in Stamford that protects about 1,300 properties in the area of this home. So you can actually see the location of the property. We could go in and you could click on and see all of these different levee protections, but now it gives us the ability for every single property to highlight that there are protections that are put in place around the community, and maybe they protect things like critical infrastructure, electric substations, hospitals, police stations, things like that, or maybe they protect the property itself. And sort of speaking of that, specifically, if we are to focus on the community risk, which is the last thing I'll show you here before I show you damages, you can actually see the community risk associated with these properties at different levels. So we may be interested in looking at this at the county level, the neighborhood level, zip code level. Maybe for this, I'll just keep it at the zip code level. You can see the property here. But at a community level, there's a lot of different types of infrastructure associated with commercial infrastructure, critical infrastructure like electric substations, police, fire, hospital, but also social infrastructure, which is just as important to community risk around schools and museums and things of that nature. But if we go in and we look at infrastructure, critical infrastructure, for instance, for this property, we can see that there's a location here. There's a critical infrastructure point. If we click on it, we can see that that's an electric substation in the zip code. So understanding that risk for the property, even if the property didn't have flood risk, it would be important to understand, well, I don't have flood risk, but the electric substation that serves my neighborhood does have flood risk. And you can see there's a few of these. Here, there's an emergency service station, a fire department that has extreme risk. There's a couple, if I recall, there's a couple electric substations in this area that have severe risk, but all of this is important in terms of understanding the community risk. And then the last thing, if we looked at social risk, you can go down and you can look at all the different types of social risks. So here, maybe I'm just interested in understanding whether or not the local school has flood risk. So I'll click here and I can see that the elementary school actually has moderate flood risk in this zip code. But this gives you the ability within the map view to understand a lot of information. As I pointed out earlier, all of this data is available in bulk form. It's available for portfolio matching. It's available for API access. Then the last thing I'll show you, just as we go back to answer any outstanding questions or any that we can get to, is the flood depth damage calculator that we have built in. So one of the questions that was asked earlier on was, how do you account for homes that have been raised? How do you account for homes that are already adapting to the risks that they have in an area? Well, one of the things that we do is we actually only look at risk associated with a home based on what we know to be the first floor elevation of the property. And then if you look at the first floor elevation of the property, we can then look at the different risk for that specific property and understand if the flood depth that would be expected annually for that property, or in a 1 in 100 year event, a 1 in 500 year event, is higher than that first floor elevation. We have a lot of this data already in our data set. We understand the land use type, the year that it was built, the number of acres, the number of stories, the primary material used for the property, the number of units, the square footage, and then the price per square foot. And all of that data gives us the ability then to create the damage functions that Dr. Kearns was talking about earlier. In order to accurately understand risk to a property, we have to understand the structure, the characteristics of the property, and then we have to be able to marry that with the actual flood damages that we have in our data set. So again, as we wrap up, a lot of this data again is available on riskfactor.com, but it's also available again in bulk form if people are interested in having access to the raw data and integrating it into your own system for whatever purposes might be appropriate. That's available. For folks that have portfolios and have specific properties that they're interested in, we do matching and portfolio pulls directly, and the integration options are always there for API access. So I think that we're close to time, but I think that also brings us to our last slide, where I just want to say thank you to everybody for another webinar, another successful webinar. We had really good attendance on the webinar. I think we got to over half the questions. There were a lot of questions that ended up coming in. Ed, you again, very provocative, lots of discussion. People are asking questions around the flood model, but I just want to say thanks to everybody. I don't know if there's any final question that you saw that was that stuck out. If not, we will try to answer the questions and send them back along, also answers that we can compile as we share the slides.
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions here, Jeremy, and I fear I talked too much and we didn't get a chance to get to many of these, but some really interesting questions that I'm not going to get to in 60 seconds. So maybe we can make some written responses to these and distribute them as well. So yeah, happy to answer these questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Dr. Kearns, for walking through the flood model with in the depth that you did. We'll share a ton of peer review research.
Depth that I did. I see what you did there, Jeremy. The depth that I did. Yeah, see, I get it.
I'm doing so often. It was an accident this time. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.